Now, according to the figures released by the Department of Housing, the number of people accessing emergency accommodation increased last month. More than 8,300 homeless people are now availing of emergency accommodation across the country. Action groups working with the homeless are appealing for a national crisis to be called. Joining us with that story and everything else this morning are Francis Fitzgibbon, CEO of Storystock, and Director of the Irish Academy of Public Relations, Ellen Gunning. Good morning to you both. You're both very welcome.
Good morning.
Ellen, I'm going to put you on the spot, even though it has nothing to do with you. Could you explain to me how a government minister can get up and say, and I'm talking about Owen Murphy here, he could stress that while the national numbers of families accessing emergency accommodation services was up, the overall trend was downwards?
It's madness, isn't it? It's lies, damned lies and statistics. Nobody can make any sense of it. What's happened with the homeless situation is that I actually heard Conor Skehan, who is the chair of the Government Housing Agency, say that we had the lowest homelessness figures in Europe. And it seems as if the government are trying to tell us all as well we shouldn't be bothered.
Sorry, don't mean to cut across you. Was he talking about the actual physical numbers, i.e. as in the thousands?
Percentage of
oh, right, OK,
per
as percentage of the population.
Yeah.
All right, OK.
But what seems to be happening is they're telling us we've got it under control, it's fine. There are 8,000 people who are homeless. Depending on which figure you believe, between 2,500 and 3,100 of those are children. Now, I know the government have introduced these hubs, which are much better than hotels. They apparently allow for rooms where you can cook, rooms where children can study. They're still not homes. And there are still almost 700 people who aren't in homes. And I think the government has two problems. One is that really, like, we're a first world country. We should not have anybody who is homeless. We really shouldn't. We should have been able to tackle this issue very simply. And the second problem we have is that the homeless numbers continue to grow. So until the government actually adopts a two-prong approach and says we need to tackle the issues which are causing homelessness, as well as the number of people who are homeless, we're just going to be on this vicious treadmill that never ends.
Yeah, Francis, you'd wonder how many of those people who are homeless directly as a result of what's been going on with our banks over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And if you look there, I was just looking at it's particularly a Dublin problem, because most of the homeless people here, the figures, 6,000 of that 8,374 are actually in Dublin. So that leaves for the rest of the country, 2,374 nationwide. And the contrast is stark. So it's an acute problem in Dublin. This has been a problem, I think, for Fine Gael for a long, long time. They do economic policy very well. Well, some would argue not so well, but they're not very good at social policy. And I think this goes back and it ties in very, very well with the banks. We never have been effective at creating policies that create a nice and a good place to live. That's kind of like the last thing we do. We never create policies. When I lived in Australia, everything was about quality of life. We finished work earlier. There was a lot more public amenity space. Sydney was a lovely place to live. I lived in Dublin for a long time. I like Dublin, but it didn't have the same kind of appeal as a place to live. And that just seems to be the last thing we think about when we're creating and crafting policies. And I'm talking about minute details within planning policies. We don't do planning very well. And that ties into why we're having the problem now with supply. And it is a supply and demand issue, in particular in Dublin. There's just not enough housing to go around, and that's what's causing it. And it's not just rough sleepers, and everyone has this idea of homelessness as being rough sleepers.
No, a big chunk of these 8,500 people are actually working people. I mean, they have jobs. They get up and they go to jobs. They're just doing it from hotels and B&Bs. Well, they're doing it after they've transported their kids possibly halfway across the city to get them to the school where they grew up.
And there's another cohort of people. I talked to a couple yesterday who are raising their daughter in a crappy, small house in the centre of Dublin that is just not fit for purpose. They have no choice but to move because they're tied into a lease. And if they move, they'll have to get a new place, and they cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment. Both working, both from the country. They don't have any grandparents around to look after the child as they would in the country, so they're paying for childcare through the nose as well. And that's my point. Like, for them, they kind of argue, what's the point in us, working, coming back at 6 o'clock, then you have your day almost starts. You're raising your child, and you're looking after your child. You have 2 hours with your child, then your child goes to bed. We want to look at policies that create a country that's not about the banks, it's not about the economy, that it's about the social economy we create that's a nice place to live.
You want to create a just society where nobody gets left behind, which is that not what Fine Gael is supposed to stand for?
Exactly. But it actually comes back to the second point of stopping creating the problem. And the problem isn't in houses that people have bought. The problem is that there's no rental accommodation. And the government has allowed people to actually chuck people out of rental accommodation because theoretically they're going to do major renovations, which means they can actually charge more money. So it's a supply and demand. There isn't enough rental accommodation available. If there isn't, you're forcing people into a homeless situation. And you're right, it's not people, it's not the traditional homeless people that people thought of. This is everybody. This could happen to anyone.
OK, let's move on to front page of the Irish Independent this morning. Mortgage relief. Interest rates are going to stay low for 2018, which is good for those of us who have mortgages and can manage them, and very good for those of us who have tracker mortgages. But another blow for those who have been robbed of theirs, and also another problem for the government, Ellen, because there's now more pressure on the government to resolve the situation, because that low rate over the next year highlights the value of these and will further make people who've had theirs taken off them, or robbed, if you prefer. And it's adding another injustice to what's been done to them.
Tracker mortgage, no, you cannot justify what happened to those people in the tracker mortgage. And the person who really annoyed me, I must admit, yesterday was the Taoiseach. The Independent Alliance had called for a criminal investigation into the banks to investigate what was going on with the tracker mortgages. And the Taoiseach came out and said, it's not a criminal investigation that's needed, it's a breach of contract. There's a big difference. I live in
White-collar crime.
White-collar crime. I live in a country where the government cannot instruct the Gardaí to investigate a crime, and that is right, and it is as it should be. And I thought, oh, stop being so pedantic. What people actually want is a solution. We're disgusted by this. There are people who have lived in homes where they've managed to stay in their homes on these tracker mortgages, but they haven't gone on holidays, they haven't had the quality of life they should have had. They're probably the lucky ones in this situation. There are people who have lost their homes through no fault of their own because the banks completely ripped them off. And there are people who have had nervous breakdowns or committed suicide. I mean, this is going on for 7 years. And we get the minister calling in the banks now this week saying, I will not tolerate this anymore and I will put a tax on you if you don't resolve it. And I will not lift the cap. This is the other one that really annoyed me. I will not lift the cap on payments if this isn't resolved. Now, when was the last time in a private business that somebody said to someone, you have completely screwed this up, so I'm not giving you an increase? What happened to, you're not fit for the job, you should lose your job? It's not about capping payments, it's not about putting taxes on, it's about a culture that has been allowed to be created within the banks where they honestly believe they can do as they like, and I don't think the government has tackled that.
Francis, do you think that the banks have played the government and Pascal Donoghue for a fool?
Yeah, they have. And I think, and Ellen is better qualified to talk about this than I am, but I think that the government have made a PR mess of this. I think they've underestimated the anger that's out there. And I think normally, you know me, Mark, I'm a cynic. Normally, I think that these issues will come and go. I think this is a different issue. I think that this is some kind of red line in the sand, that I think there's an anger. I spoke to somebody last night who is affected by this, who I didn't know was affected by this, who almost came out as an admission to me because she felt embarrassed and ashamed that she had done something wrong in the first place. And I thought, you know what, that's part of our institutional shame that we have in Ireland very often, admitting this. We don't want to talk about things like finances, our own personal finances in particular. And I think the banks depend on that a lot, and they depend on the fact that we internalise all that. I'll just deal with that myself. I think there was a very pertinent case yesterday against the PTSB. Somebody took them to court and they won. I would encourage anybody who is a victim on this issue to consider taking them to court, because I think you will get a lot more by taking the banks to court than you will by going by the redress system, which is banks deciding on the level of money that they should give you because they did you wrong, which is criminal in and of itself. And I think that if somebody came up with some kind of crowdfunding solution
or class actions,
crowdfunding solution to get money to give the people who are affected by this scandal the cash reserves to take on the banks, I, for one, would certainly give wholeheartedly to it. And I think a lot of people in the country would. Actually,
that addresses the thing that's stopping people, because if you don't win the case, you lose everything.
Yeah.
So the risk is very, very high. And apparently the banks are sending out, when they send you out your letter to say, we're sorry, we got your tracker mortgage wrong, it's a 7-page letter that they send you. They're legaled up to the eyeballs.
Well, I'm considerably older than both of you, and sadly I've seen at least 4 major banking crises. The crisis happens, the taxpayer ends up paying the bill, and the banks mind their manners for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, usually about a decade, and then it kind of happens again. The extraordinary thing about this is that in the teeth of what happened in 2008 and 2009, as all of that was unfolding and the country was unravelling, they were doing this. They didn't even wait 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years before they did this and put their hand back in their pockets again. As people were literally being thrown out of their homes, they were still putting their hands in their pocket.
And this was just after we saved them from bankruptcy.
It's absolutely extraordinary. The arrogance is breathtaking. Anyway, listen, thank you both very much indeed.